I finally decided that I was going to leave our marriage, I had said to my ex-husband, I won't be your wife anymore, but I will always be your friend. And because of what I went through in my journey with addiction with him, I knew that he would be alone in the world in a lot of ways because of what he was struggling with. And I could always see the humanness in him, and I could also see the struggle. And I didn't want him to ever think that me not being with him in that way in life meant that we were going to disconnect 100%.
Right, right.
And so I left that relationship with that intention and that mindset. And I remember reaching out to the attorney who had helped us set up some paperwork for our kids. And the response essentially was something to the effect of, okay, well, we're going to meet and we're going to figure out how you can get as much out of this as possible. And I was like,
disco.
Wait. What are you talking about, Lise? And we're talking about that contentiousness, that idea of how that change becomes a battleground. And trauma is stress. Stress is trauma. It's all a fear-based response. And what those primary responses are fight, flight, right? There's also the freeze response. But so when we take something where people are going to go through significant stress, we're talking about the disintegration of the home, right? Mm-hmm. The nest gets crumbled up and has to be rebuilt. We're already going to go into a stress response. It's going to be toxically stressful. It will feel traumatic for people. And then we create a culture, a systemic culture around capitalizing on that fight. We're literally doing biological damage to people. I mean, that's just, we know that at
You
this
mean
point.
the financial aspects of like what you talked about with the attorneys where they were like, hey, let's, what can we get out of this? Or,
yeah, just the warfare piece of it. Like, ooh, what's in it for me? What can I fight for? What can I win? There's nothing to win in a divorce. It is a major loss. It's a huge grief for everybody involved.
Right. Mother Merck and GSK can't make money off it. Right,
it's a for-profit healthcare system, and we're one of the few countries in the world that spends 95% of our GDP dollars for healthcare on post-diagnostic treatment. So we're going to wait for people to get sick, and then we're going to invest. Right. And any other model in a well-developed nation in the world is prevention-based. And they both economically thrive, but somewhere along the way we got this idea, and we just haven't had enough people that are man enough and woman enough to say, we're not doing this anymore, and we're changing it. So, again, in this more centrist view, I have some hopes that some of what's going on right now, although some of it I'm like, what are we doing here? But there are some people that I'm like, I don't necessarily like how it's going down, but I'm giving some, vote or some hope to the idea that some of these things will be dismantled and rebuilt in a way where we move more toward a prevention model.
So I'm here with Winden Rowe. Winden is from the Center, KSQ, which is a therapy organization, we can say. How would you define what the Center KSQ is for me?
Yeah, it's a good question. It morphs, but really the origin of it is counseling services.
Okay.
But because of how things have developed and evolved, we really do community-based wellness services. So we do mediation for families. Now we have ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and we're moving into the psychedelic arena. Okay. So we have a pretty diverse range of services that we offer, but the heart of it is what we call trauma-informed care. Right. So minimizing the potential for trauma and or treating trauma that has already occurred.
Right. Right. So now, where are you from originally? Are you from Oakley, or where are you from? You said that you'd been in this building before, so I'm assuming that you're a Kennett girl. Are you a Kennett Square girl?
Well, actually, I'm a Unionville girl.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who went to Maine for 10 years, and then I came back and I relocated to Kennett. So I am a Kennett girl, but I'm like a transplant.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about your background. So you're a Unionville girl. So you're Unionville High School, Unionville, right? Okay.
Unionville High School, yep.
So I'm always interested in, and we had a conversation before this conversation. We got to talk a little bit. And so my background has been, I have trauma in my life. I was led to the gift of desperation, which led me to my first treatment. And my therapist was at the VA in Philadelphia at 801 Arch Street, and he was a Vietnam veteran missing a leg, which probably, in many ways saved my life, because I was not in a great place when I first started seeing him. I still was dealing with the after effects of post-traumatic stress disorder, and the disease of addiction, which was kicking my ass. So I'm interested in therapists for many reasons. I see you as valuable to the community, lifesavers in many ways, and for people who are in a desperate state, a place where they can go to basically. I remember the first time when I walked in, I was not in a great spot. And the gentleman who was behind the counter was just, he was actually getting his qualifications to become a therapist. He was in training. And I walked in, and he asked me a question or two, and I just started to tell stories. And he was like, oh. He said, hold up. He said, I'm not trying to say that what you're saying to me doesn't have merit. He said, but let's wait to unpack it in front of somebody who's prepared to deal with what you had to say. And I thought that was so powerful because it didn't undermine my experience, my trauma, the pain that I was in at that very moment. It just deferred that temporarily to a point where it could be unpacked in a let's say controlled environment for what it's worth. And I was so grateful for that. So he passed during the pandemic. Right? I've since then I have a therapist at the VIC in Delaware now, in Wilmington. And I've had so far now that he's my third one. And I tend to build deep relationships with the people that I see. And I think maybe at least in part that's because, the vulnerability that comes from those type of relationships tends to build a deeper bond. You know what I mean? Like it's not just, I had a therapist in between my first and my third that felt more superficial. And she didn't have a similar background. My first therapist was a veteran, and my therapist now is a veteran. So there was something that clicked there too. You know what I mean? I just found it easier to unpack where I was going with it. And not to say that the second therapist didn't give me benefit. They did. So, definitely in the mix of people that I interview here includes people who come from your background in your field. And there were some things that I found compelling on your website that will actually at some point we'll come back to, because I'm curious about some things.
Okay.
So you deal with post-traumatic stress disorder for veterans, right? What would you say the percentage of people that you see are veterans at your practice?
So my caseload is probably like 15%, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe 20. It fluctuates, and it's interesting to kind of pay attention to the trends where those fluctuations occur. But I'd say historically across 12 years, it's probably averages about 15 to 20%.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I'm not going to say the reason, but one of the reasons why I was like, oh, we got to get her in here, was one of the things, and I'm paraphrasing here, but one of the things that was listed, maybe not on the website, but maybe in one of your bios or something that I saw written, said something to the effect of dealing with the trauma that comes from the litigation of divorce. And I was like, woo, that's intense. Having that in my past history, and it can't be understated how traumatic that can be for some. It can be a full-on battleground. And, emotional warfare, psychological warfare, financial warfare, you know what I mean? Like, God forbid, physical warfare, although I didn't go there. But I do know that at least for males, I've read at some point that the suicide rate for males going through divorce is far, far higher than the populace at large. You think that, that disconnect, there's been and this is just an impression that I've had from my experience, and I've got the benefit of distance and time. but that there was a point where, I think that frankly, women's rights were probably not well protected or well articulated in that surrounding, and there was a shift where eventually that it shifted, and then women were reached a position of strength, and then that strength became so strong that in fact men were ill-equipped to be able to handle those environments. And I saw that on your website, part of what you did, and that, I thought this was really compelling, is that that as part of your practice you provide mediation services, which is not something that I've ever seen in an organization like yours, where it would be blended, where you would have attorneys and therapists and mediators all combined, where you could provide those type of services. So can we talk a little bit about how you ended up there, or how do you end up from just a practice where you're providing therapy and that type of thing to was there a point where you realized that it was something that needed to be done, or was there a personal experience? How did you get there?
Personal experience. Geez, it's like, how long do we have? So
this is for the record, there is no limit. This is what they call long form.
Okay.
So if it goes an hour or 2 hours, whatever, we'll just, however long it goes is how long it goes.
We'll wing it. Okay.
So,
That's good to know. So I was born in the 70s, and I was a child of the 80s and 90s, and have my combat veteran father, and my parents went through a separation and then a divorce. And the thing that really stood out to me as a child is that I didn't really know other people that were going through that, except another friend of mine in grade school whose parents had divorced. And I remember thinking like, oh, that can happen, because that was newer for the time. And it was at the beginning of a wave where, when you look at the data, divorce starts trending upward in our culture. And there weren't services, and there weren't awarenesses in schools and in our systems. Like, we just didn't know what to do with it. And I remember looking back and thinking as an adult that I wish more people had known how to be there for me and for my family and my siblings, but there was no response. It's almost like people didn't used to know how to respond to addiction. It was the same thing.
Right.
And then I got
in some cases they still don't.
Well, oh yeah,
we'll go there too.
No, that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, we're going to go there too.
Well, good.
So, okay, cool.
So then, in my adult life, I went through my own separation and divorce because of trauma and addiction, and not having equipment for that. And I remember when I finally decided that I was going to leave our marriage, I had said to my ex-husband, I won't be your wife anymore, but I will always be your friend.
Right.
And because of what I went through in my journey with addiction with him, I knew that he would be alone in the world in a lot of ways because of what he was struggling with. And I could always see the humanness in him, and I could also see the struggle. And I didn't want him to ever think that me not being with him in that way in life meant that we were going to disconnect 100%.
Right.
And so I left that relationship with that intention and that mindset. And I remember reaching out to the attorney who had helped us set up some paperwork for our kids and all of that long-term planning stuff. And I told him what was going on. And the response essentially was something to the effect of, okay, well, we're going to meet and we're going to figure out how you can get as much out of this as possible. And I was like,
disco.
Wait, what are you talking about?
Right.
And so I said, no, we're not. And there's a really long story behind it, but my ex-husband had significant assets from losing his mom at a very young age. And so I always looked at that as like, well, that's not mine.
Right.
That's like blood money if I go after that. That's screwed up. And so it became this really interesting dance of us trying to figure out what we decided together as a couple and as parents to these children. Don't get me wrong, it was messy. Like, it was messy. There was addiction involved. But in the end, I believe that what happened for us, because now we're friends, we call each other, we talk. I mean, we have this great relationship. it's challenged by, again, the addiction and all the trauma. But I was like, why isn't this the practice? Like, why aren't we making decisions together instead of talking through these people who are not invested in our wellness?
Right.
And so,
with their own underlying agendas, frankly.
Right. I mean, they're in a business.
Right.
So fast forward, this thing popped up, really interesting. So in the field of counseling, they now offer mediation training to counselors.
Okay.
And so I was like, well, that's pretty cool. So I'm going to get this training, and I'm also going to get these credits that I need for my license maintenance. And I did the training, and I was like, this is fascinating and something that I absolutely want to engage in our services here. But the reason that I brought in the attorneys at law to partner with is, one, I know that they have the same mindset that I do.
Right.
And two, I don't have a legal degree, and I don't keep up on how the laws change from year to year.
Right.
So I want to protect people from the potential long-term harm of the divorce not being executed as safely and in a detailed way as possible. So that's how that all came to be.
Right. The power of mediation versus the power of standing tall in front of the man or woman in court. I mean, that can't be... I've been through mediation through other circumstances, not with regards to divorce, but but with regards to custody and with regards to other legal things that have to do with business, and it's stressful enough as it is. I don't think people understand the challenge or the difficulty that comes from when people square off to try and figure out what's next. I mean, there's such a like the financial complications that come from that. You know what I mean? Like, you split apart a family. Now you have two separate entities who also must support two separate households. So there's a financial strain that comes along with that. Then there's the strain associated with, if you have children, the separation of the children from one household to the next. And that young man right there experienced it firsthand. So, he, when I was separated and ultimately divorced, I went from I was dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder addiction. I had a cocktail of challenges that I was dealing with, and frankly, if you're of the belief like I am, those things don't go away. We just deal with them. But I watched I went from a 7-day-a-week dad to an every other week alternate holiday dad, without question, the most painful thing I've ever experienced in my life, and long-term pain, frankly. This is the cool part where I can talk about these things and I don't have to worry about whether or not my ex sees it. Hi. This is the transparency part we talked about. So my ex and I were oil and water. We were not the type of situation that you had, right? Where, you made a decision ultimately that even though it was going to be challenging, that you wanted to remain friends with the person that you did not have that, right? You know what I mean? Like, it was an adversarial relationship at best. And there was a point where the, part of the most of the time that my two children had was in her household, and then I got them every other weekend. So at one point, the narrative became that the time that my children had with me was damaging them, and that we should have, he should be in therapy. So they picked a therapist and they put him in therapy, and I said, okay, you know what I mean? I'll split paying for it or whatever. I ended up paying for more of it than that. But so we wasn't more than maybe in like the second session, and I went in to take him to the therapist. It was a long ride for me. I was not local. They moved, and I was the one shuttling back and forth. And I come down to the therapist's office, and it's funny how some things are so incredibly pivotal. He goes in, sits in the office, and I'm sitting in the waiting room. And after about 10 minutes, the door opens up, and he says, "Hey, would you go sit in the waiting room?" He said, "Would you come in here?" I was like, "Okay." I come in, close the door, sit down. He says, "Were you aware that your ex and her husband are sociopaths?"
Oh, wow.
And I went,
Jeez.
I said, "What?" didn't know what the fuck sociopath was. You know what I mean? Like I knew enough about the root word to make my hair stand up on the back of my neck. You know what I mean? Because sociopath and psychopath, although they're different, come on the similar root. I knew it was like some serious stuff, right?
Yeah.
So for a minute, I was, really caught up in what does this really all mean? And then a friend of mine told me to read The Sociopath Next Door, which I did, which was a complete game changer for me, just in terms of setting a reference for, what I was really ultimately dealing with. And, and I came to the realization that, I guess the long and short of the reason why I'm saying this to you is that I don't make light of the damage, right, that can come from sometimes divorces that go well, right? And then ultimately the pain that can come from when things don't.
Yeah.
Right? So when I saw on your site that part of what you dealt with was the trauma associated with, right, divorce.
Yeah.
I said, oh,
yeah,
I like what you do.
Aw.
I think it's important and powerful. Frankly, could save lives.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like I know what it's like to be despondent and to the edge of the volcano because of the after effect of what can happen when you're dealing with difficulties and challenges associated with that. So
yeah.
And the fact that remember what I said about having therapists and then ultimately a therapist that can relate to. Right. Mm-hmm. And that was why I asked you about what your background was, because you've had the history of that in your life, both in your, childhood life and then in your adult life. It means that it enhances your level of approachability and communication level when you get somebody that comes from that background. You're not just speaking from experience in terms of, education, but also in terms of life experience too. There's an empathy that connects with that you just can't get anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, my divorce was, a couple of things. When, my brain goes in a lot of directions in conversations like this. The first thing is when we're talking about families and we're talking about that contentiousness, right? You said something earlier, either in the meeting before the meeting or the meeting, the one that we're in right now, but that idea of how that change becomes a battleground, and trauma is stress. Stress is trauma. It's all a fear-based response, and what those primary responses are fight, flight, right? There's also the freeze response, but so when we take something where people are going to go through significant stress, we're talking about the disintegration of the home, right? Mm-hmm. The nest gets crumbled up and has to be rebuilt. We're already going to go into a stress response. It's going to be toxically stressful. It will feel traumatic for people. And then we create a culture, a systemic culture around capitalizing on that fight. We're literally doing biological damage to people. I mean, that's just, we know that at
You
this
mean
point.
the financial aspects of like what you talked about with the attorneys, where they were like, hey, let's, what can we get out of this? Or,
yeah, just the warfare piece of it. Like, ooh, what's in it for me? What can I fight for? What can I win? There's nothing to win in a divorce. It is a major loss. It's a huge grief for everybody involved. Right. And it sets for kids who have been through divorce there's a whole new system that you have to navigate, which is going from place to place. Like you're never really in one place 100%. Home is a temporary experience. Right. There's a lot. So there's that piece of it. And then I don't want to criticize the therapist that worked with you as a family because I don't know the full dynamic of what was going on. But we start by trying to see if we can bring people into the same space before we start labeling and marginalizing people even more. And I don't know the details. So it's very possible that was all
actually
true.
in the interest of transparency, it helped me a tremendous amount. And the reason why was because once I started doing some reading, I realized that I was ill-equipped for what I was dealing with.
Right.
And I kept, it set and established a baseline for a different reality versus the reality that I'd set, because my reality was, why can't we all just get along?
Right.
Why can't we just make this work?
Yeah.
Why can't, with reasonability and rationality, we should all be able to be reasonable and rational, and we can never establish that baseline because, opposing parties would not accept any reasonability or rationality. You know what I mean? We couldn't shift out of the battleground into something. And I kept saying sooner or later, we ought to be able, sooner or later, everybody cools out and chills and we can make this thing work. And it just would not after years and years and years. And then you finally come and somebody articulates it like that, a professional, right? And you go, well, wait a minute. Like, that's not like a friend of yours saying that. Like, that's somebody who has a professional background.
Right.
So it put more credence to the terminology specifically, which caused me to start reading.
Right.
And that reading kind of gave me a reference point that, wait a minute, I'm not dealing with people that see things exactly the way that I do. Now,
right.
For me, you know, part of an amends process is seeing what I've done wrong. That's part of what we talked about, the recovery process. And you know, and I certainly see that, you know, in many ways, my behavior, my addiction, all these things, you know, kick the beehive, right? You know what I mean? Like, you expect, you know, in interest of taking ownership for what you've done wrong. I've done much wrong in my life, without question. But, you know, there was a part of me that just felt like sooner or later we ought to be able, because we have these children that are ultimately we consider the most important thing, and they're caught in the middle of this battleground, and we should be able to come to some mutual common ground, you know, without this anger or this, you know, this tension, so that we can raise these children in a healthy environment. And I could just never seem to get there. Right. So, you know, for what it's worth, you know what I mean? Like, and truth is, you know, it probably wasn't unpacked in a way that, you know, it probably could have been unpacked differently, but that relationship was so adversarial. There was no way you were getting us in the same room without it being hot.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I went through the same thing. I mean, not necessarily the details, but I like that analogy of the beehive. And I would say that we kicked each other's beehives in different ways. And then that continued to happen across a lot of time. So there was a lot of pain that continued on. I mean, it's been like 17 years for me. So there's been a lot of pain that has reemerged across time. And I think the obvious side for him is being in and out of an addiction. And for me, it's been learning how to be appropriately responsive to that. And it took a really long time for me to learn, like, where is my place in all of this? And there are times where, even in the last couple of years, like, I mean, I thought my heart was broken back then. It, you know, again, without going into the backstory to stay on topic, there were things that happened in more recent years where, you know, my heart was shattered for a different reason around a different issue, and watching my kids go through a lot of grief and a lot of pain. And somehow I just think what it all comes back to for me is that it can be a significant period of time before there's even any hope of any kind of connection. But I have a commitment to leaving that door open to when or if there is the opportunity for something good, whatever version of good that is, to keep that space. Because I think especially when children are involved in the relationship, that I look at the long view and I'm like, oh my God, there are going to be grandchildren and marriages and all of these things that no matter what, I know that as a parent, my job will be to set all of that aside and be in the same room and not just be civil, but to see if we can be kind, because there's something that we share.
Right.
That, I mean, here's the truth is, like, I have 2 boys, and the only person on the planet, and people would argue that this isn't true, but I know it is true. The only person on the planet who loves my children and knows the depth of that love more than anybody is their dad.
Right.
Even in and out of all of his stuff.
Right.
I know that he knows that. And that's a wisdom that we share. And I know that my kids know that.
Right.
And I also see them doing their work to love him and to navigate loving him through all of that difficulty.
Right. Because it folds over into their experience with him.
And their identity.
Right.
They're part of that. That's their gene pool. That's their family tree. That's their legacy. So for me, it's been learning to navigate this balance of those behaviors are not okay, and that is a place where there needs to be a significant boundary. Like, that's just not allowed in my life.
Right.
And here's this whole other thing that we have where, I mean, we have children together. These people will be next to me, you know, God willing, when I take my last breath. And so I try to maintain some balance there. And I just want to say this, that I don't want people who are listening to this thinking like, oh, she put such a happy spin on it. Yeah, I'm in a very peaceful and content place in my life that way. And I have also felt the most despair and shame and anger and rage and grief around that also.
Right.
Like, it's not about one or the other, it's all of it.
Right.
So I think that's the biggest piece that I hope people that listen to this really understand, that the emotional landscape of that kind of change and loss isn't about trying to get to one place. It's about how do you figure out how to make room for the full range of what you're going to experience.
Right.
It's hard.
Well, you said two words at the same time in the same sentence. One was balance and the other one was boundaries. Mm-hmm. And for people like me, I've had difficulty with both. Mm-hmm. I wonder, at least in part, I mean, we had talked about, the experience of, divorce and, and how that, we had talked about the power of vulnerability before we came in here, right? And that, and I had shared with you about, my experience with therapists and those therapists having backgrounds in what I had experienced. And I think that led to a certain level of empathy that gave them the ability to be able to handle me in a way or connect with me in a way that I couldn't necessarily otherwise have enjoyed. And, and I think that level of, whether or not it was articulated, there was a sense about it that just let me feel more. I remember I probably shared more with my most recent therapist in 1 week than I did in a year with his predecessor, right? It was just like, I was just like, you're my boy, bro. Like, it was a click. We just clicked. I was like, here we go. And it was like drinking from a fire hose coming out of me, because it was just like I felt comfortable and I could just let it all fly. So what it leads me to think about, so we've talked about that I've been in, substance abuse recovery for 11 years and some change. So 12-step member, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sponsored by a gentleman who's been clean for 43 years. At some point, we hope to get him on the show. I have, gentlemen that I sponsor, damn near a football team worth of them. And, right. And, they're a crazy bunch of characters who ultimately help me to grow and change. There are all these different things that are caught in, that are basically tied up in what we share in that arena. Right. One thing is, we don't comment on outside issues. Right. So, there are things that are addiction and recovery related, but some people need more help. Some people seek outside help. And then ultimately through that outside help comes things like, medically assisted treatments and those type of things. And simultaneously, I'm in a program where we talk about total abstinence is the only way. Yeah. So the challenge ultimately becomes trying to navigate our way through in one arena where we, are, and I think that's really, it makes sense to me why that exists in that way, because it's about precedent. One is too many and 1,000's never enough. And once I let the gorilla out of the cage, the gorilla decides where it's going to go from here. So having that hardline position ultimately sets a standard or a baseline where if I don't step over it, then I'm safe, right? And then there's another part of me, and that part of me is the dis-ease. And so when we talk about ketamine therapy, or we talk about psychedelics, or we talk about those things, it tickles something in the back of my head when I'm in art college dropping acid. Right?
Yeah,
it makes me go like, oh, wouldn't that be nice, right? And then I tie it to post-traumatic stress disorder, and I just watched an interesting thing about a group that go to it's either Mexico or South America to engage in a certain psychedelic rituals to help them deal with post-traumatic stress in a way, because the therapies that are approved by the VA and the FDA aren't necessarily authorized by, right? And a good example is, and we talked about this, the gentleman that was on the show previous talking about the ganglion block. And he was like, the VA does not approve this as a treatment. But he went down and had the shot and immediately had a positive response from it. So there's some of me that thinks that, and it's very hard to delineate, right? How much of that appeal to me, right, for that outside help, specifically, whether or not I went down the path of using, a mood or mind altering substance like a psychedelic, how much of that is really ultimately tied to the potential of dealing with childhood trauma, the results of post-traumatic stress disorder, the fear and worry and anxiety and remorse and all the things that go along with that. And how much of that tickles my funny bone because I'm like, woo, that sounds like fun. Why don't we go do that? Right. And, so when I'm sitting with somebody who's actually, a practitioner at a professional level, right, and dealing with, post-traumatic stress disorder and some of these other things and using some of these newly found therapies like ketamine and that type of thing, I typically, I kind of like want to go down that path a little bit just to talk about like, how does that really, how effective has that been? You know what I mean? Like, from a positive, there is no such thing as 100% anything one way or the other, right? So, but, in the interest of people who might be listening to this who also suffer from the disease of addiction, in fact, and, and are looking for it. Now, this is, for me, on the one side, as a hardliner who's a 12-step member who says that, no mind or mood altering substances, for me to go down this path, at least in a strange way, is kind of like counter to what I would ordinarily talk about. But on the other side, in the interest of open-mindedness and having people get help, I feel it's important to share all viewpoints, and yours is important to me. So talk a little bit about that, like the ketamine therapy and how that's worked for you and the success level and what your experience has been. Can you share some?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Again, it's like how much time. So, I'll back up to the conversation about addiction and then roll into the conversation about ketamine and psychedelics in general. Is when we're talking about addiction, the first place that I think we can start is, are we talking about a disease or are we talking about a response? And of course, I think it's a both and.
Right.
But the thing that we have come to, now keep in mind, I'm not a clinical mental health therapist. I am.
Okay.
But I'm a trauma therapist, and there's a big difference. Traditional clinical mental health lens looks at what's wrong with a person, and then we come up with symptoms, and then we want to use those symptoms as data to treat those symptoms. And sometimes we can teach people coping mechanisms to help them suppress symptoms and manage symptoms, but it's not root cause work.
Okay.
Trauma therapy is root cause. So we look at what happened to the person, or maybe what didn't happen for them.
Right.
And how, as a result, did that kick off a sense of feeling vulnerable and unsafe in a world where it's not safe to be vulnerable. And so how do we deal with feeling all of those things in a world where feelings are kind of weird and stigmatized and taboo?
Right.
So addiction is a beautiful tool when you think about it, right?
Okay.
I'm going to get immediate relief from something that I don't have in my surroundings any kind of solution or support for.
Now, when you say addiction, you mean the actual use, which gives relief, correct?
Oh,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
sure. And the other thing is, I think addiction is really stigmatized in another sense. Your addiction has been to substances. My addiction has been to, you used these words earlier. I used them, and then you used them, right? Boundaries was the one word, and I forget.
Or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof, and not knowing really
Sure.
well, in a household where there's addiction,
right.
One person's going to do the substances, and the other person is probably going to go into a caregiving, problem-solving role.
Right. Control.
Yeah.
Fix, manage, and control.
Safety, right? Both people are trying to get safety.
Right.
But that's not how we think about it, or we talk about it. So now all these behaviors start, and we're like this volcano, right? So framing addiction that way, I think, is really important to start.
Okay.
So if we see addiction as the tip of the iceberg,
right,
and all of the other stuff underneath of it, I think 12-step is brilliant, and it has saved the lives of many people that I love many times, and it has helped me.
Right.
And at the same time, there are certain things that being in a room with people and working through the steps might not actually address.
Well, the thing that the step process taught me was that I don't have a drug problem, I have a me problem.
Oh.
Right? You know, the things that the step process taught me was that the drugs are just a symptom of a deeper problem.
Exactly.
Right? And yes, some of that can be addressed with a 12-step journey, without question. And I'm the after effect, the result of that. I'm the dance after the volcano is a direct result of that for me.
Yeah.
But to say that I would not be here without a deeper journey that included things outside of the 12 steps would be a misnomer and incorrect. You know, I saw my therapist at the VA for a year before I went in and showed him, I had attended my first meeting, and he almost fell off his chair. He had been clean at the time for 32 years. Wow. Right? You know what I mean? And he had never once suggested to me that that's what I should do. It was just, attraction rather than promotion, as they say. And I was attracted to my wife now. She and I have been together for a long time. You know what I mean? She had some experiences with and seen some things. And, and also she never said to me, hey, maybe this is something you should do. I saw other people that were living a way where they were dancing, right? And in my head, whether I was physically there or not, I was in the volcano a lot. And, and they call that the gift of desperation. And I finally just reached a point where, it was a combination. I used to say all the time, like, the really cool thing about therapy was, like, I got to go to a meeting and share for an hour, right? Like, I couldn't get that. In a meeting, I might get my hand up and share for 5 minutes, and I might have a conversation before and after. It was a dialogue, but to be able to, to go and just completely just unfold and unpack at that level, you know what I mean? I think in some ways helped accelerate my process a lot faster than it would have been if it was just organically held in meetings by themselves. So, it leads me to like all kinds of other thoughts, like, so the addiction piece, like especially the addiction that you experienced with your former husband, right? So, would you say that leads to some level of, I think sometimes the challenge is that the society at large, especially if you are not somehow affected or connected to people who have been on the journey and seen the pain that they go through, it's easy to take a position of, oh, look at those people. Or I saw something to the effect today of somebody basically pointing out that somebody who's getting ready to hold a position or a chair in the new administration is, can you believe that, he's a former heroin addict?
Oh, that pissed me off.
Me too, because I was like, well, wait a minute. Like, okay, that person has a past history, and I'm not necessarily qualifying or quantifying whether somebody is qualified for the position based on, it should be based on their background and their intelligence and their knowledge and all those other things.
Aptitude.
But to take somebody and say they're disqualified in some way because of that past experience, it was just painful. You know what I mean? And it also connected me to the fact that people judge what they don't know, and they don't empathize with what they're not connected to, right? And so, what's compelling to me in a way is like your past history with, experiencing addiction firsthand and trying to establish those boundaries, and what you talked about being to the edge of the volcano and stuff. It leads you to a position where when you get somebody who comes in who's dealing with addiction, right, that you don't see it with that same just clinical connection. Right? Like there's something deeper to it than that. And I think that's essential if you're going to, you almost, and I don't know how to I almost think like some of the qualifying points to be able to hold a position where, you would be able to help somebody else is that connection of empathy first. That's why a 12-step process is so incredibly important, because you're surrounded by, there are no professionals. We're, you know what I mean? Like once you walk into a room, you're one of, right? It's the empathy that ultimately gives us the power to be able to help each other in a way that even clinicians can't do.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So, you know, and the hard part is, what are you going to tell a clinician that's dealing with somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder that they technically probably aren't as effective because they don't have that background?
It's possible.
But I've experienced it firsthand, right? You know what I mean? So, the question becomes, like, how do you build a practice around that, frankly? Like, how do you select people, right, who are going down a path of, because you and I talked about this beforehand, like, you know, before the conversation about the power of vulnerability, right? And we're all running around with this, you know, this facade or this ego or this, you know, outward appearance that ultimately is palatable and buyable by society at large. These are, you know what I mean? This is the you know, the avatar that we put forth of, you know, the representation of who we are, right? And the downside of that is that people don't get to a deeper level of qualification about, you know, where we're connected empathetically between each other, and, you know, and the deep ties that, you know what I mean? Like, I often wonder, like, you know, I'm no clinician or therapist or any of those things, but, you know, like, and I'm not even sure if legally I'd be bound to not ask the questions that go down that path, but I'd at least in part, you know what I mean, be trying to know at a deeper level, not the who, but the why of people, right? You know what I mean? Because, you know, because if I was going to move forward with trying to pair people with people that they would help, having that deeper level of empathetic connection, I believe, would more likely enhance effectivity in that relationship. So I would put a veteran with a veteran, or put somebody who has PTSD with somebody who has history, maybe not directly, but maybe even indirectly with somebody who has PTSD, or, you know what I mean? Like, does that even sound like it makes sense?
Oh, yeah. I mean, 1,000%. That's why earlier I was like, well, I'm not a clinical mental health therapist. I'm a trauma therapist because of, I mean, several different bullet points, but that's one of them, is we're not trying to be in a position of authority where we're looking at someone and we're saying, okay, here's everything that we're going to fix. Right. We're getting into a room with someone and we're trying to figure out, all right, what's happening at the very, like, deeply felt level here with this person.
Okay.
And that's why I love trauma. I do.
So, that's why I love trauma.
I love it. I love it,
Well,
because it strips everything down to several core principles. And so all of this fighting that goes on in the world about, you know, should we use these words or not those words or whatever, all of that washes away.
Right.
And it doesn't fucking matter, because it's about addressing our pains and our wounds and trying to figure out what our path to healing is. And that's humanity. Like, there isn't anywhere that you go on the planet where that doesn't exist, you know?
Right.
So that's the part that I love about it. And I want to say, for anybody who's listening, I have as many faults with the field of mental health as people who make complaints about the field of mental health. I recognize how deeply broken the system has been for a long time. And when you ask earlier, how many veterans do I work with? It's usually like 15 to 20% of my caseload. But a lot of my work with those veterans is helping refer them out to places where they're going to make those connections with veterans because of that shared understanding. Right. So I know what my limitations are.
Do you find that the same with people who have addiction? Like that, although you don't necessarily send them to a 12-step program, or do you?
I mean, wellness in general is comprehensive. So if anybody comes into my office and I think I'm the only person that will help them on their journey, there's something wrong with me and I need to check myself at the door. So yeah, I mean, my master's degree, if you look at it and you pull it out, it says I have a master's in science, and it's in interesting, community and trauma counseling. And I was like, what's the word community all about? Like,
you do them all at once.
Well, I knew I was going to go get a degree
Right.
in becoming, air quotes, expert or a well-learned individual in the field of trauma and traumatic stress. But I was like, what's the community thing all about? And you figure it out right away. You're like, this is healing and recovery is not a one-stop shop. So
Right.
it's all of it.
Right.
So I have 12-step people that are like, I am a diehard 12-stepper. I have people that come in that I work with in the addiction setting. They're like, I don't want to go to another 12-step meeting ever again.
Right.
So they might go check out Recovery Dharma, or they might go to a running group for sober people.
Right.
I don't care.
Right.
What I want to know is that they're getting into that place where they can be vulnerable and they can be real and authentic, and then they can start to be kinder to themselves. And that's it.
Well, that's been, at least in part of my journey, is that. So I think early on in anything that you're exploring where your life is on the line,
Yes.
right? You tend to, for me, the only way to really survive that was to take more of an extremist approach.
Right.
And then, ultimately in an extremist approach, you realize the areas where you probably are overly extreme and therefore wrong. And then, sooner or later you realize that, there are many ways to the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
And over time I've started to basically let my guard down a little bit. Like, that doesn't necessarily, my viewpoints have changed. There are simply no more ways of doing it wrong. I did all those. You know what I mean? Like, I look and I go, oh, you know what I mean? Like, I took, the admission of wrongdoing. You know what I mean? When you realize that when you stood on ground thinking that you were right about something, only to find out that you were mistaken. And it's an exercise in humility, right? You know what I mean? Maybe being humiliated and then humility, but it's an exercise in humility. And then wisdom with age is that you really realize how many, hills that you almost died fighting on, to only realize that that wasn't a hill you shouldn't have died fighting on, if that makes sense. And I'm just to the point now where, and it's the reason why, as time goes on, I'm more interested in the exploration of what are everybody else doing, right? It was one of the reasons why I thought it'd be really good to get you in here, because I'm like, okay, when you're only walking maybe one path up the side of a mountain, you can only really see so much distance on one side. A mountain's generally like, it's got a front and a back and sides. So you're only really seeing so much on each side, and then you really can't see. So there's a lot of other ways up to the top of the mountain, and I'm starting to distance myself, at least from an extremist viewpoint. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm changing my path, but also, was that Edie Brickell song? This eye looks with love, and this eye looks with judgment.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Yeah, free me, take the sight out of this eye, it says, and it never says which eye. You know what I mean? And trying to look more with the love eye and instead of the judgment eye, because it's so easy for me to be like, you're not doing it the right way because, or this is the way you do it. And then just coming to realize that that doesn't appeal to others.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm in the midst of just finishing a book, Mel Robbins's Let Them, the Let Them theory.
Yeah.
Right. And, and just basically, for what it's worth, sometimes just one simple concept is really helpful. Like, without really getting into the depth of the book, and it's just basically another way of articulating surrender and control, and a lot of those other things that come with, that are hallmarks of humanity and the disease of addiction, is just letting other people just let them, you know what I mean? And let me take control of doing. It's funny because it's in alignment with what they talk about in the step process. You know what I mean? Like admission of powerlessness.
Yeah.
Right. You know what I mean? And
step one.
Right. Exactly.
That's
you know what I
it.
mean? Like that, to be able to have, it's funny how sometimes I've got to hear the exact same thing from a completely different angle that's not even in alignment with, and I go, wait a minute, like I can onboard that. You know what I mean? Like, instead of, the admission of powerlessness, because most times my control issues over not having power over something really have to do with them. the magic that whoever the fuck them are, you know what I mean? The them, you know what I mean? And I'm just like, and just being able to use that terminology, just let them. I'm like, ooh, you know what I mean? Like if I could read the cover of that book and throw it out and get everything I need, right? You know, get everything I needed, you know what I mean? Like that's, and frankly, it's just another way of articulating something that I'm sometimes doing and sometimes not, but hearing it articulated in a different way reinforces it in a way. And I've got a guy in a truck right now driving down South Carolina and back, and he's listening to it too. And he texted me this morning. He was like, "Let them." He texted me, and I was like, "Right," you know what I mean? And then I was like, and then I paused for a minute, and then he was like, "And then let me," which is the second part of what he talks about, which is basically, you know, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot, you know, control, and the power to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? Without that second part and without the wisdom, you know what I mean, it gets lost in. You know, you could just easily take the position of, oh, let it go, you know what I mean, when you can take control or power or action over something. And then other times, I got my hands gripped on tight to something that I should just be letting go over because it can't be controlled.
Yeah.
And, you know, and just articulate it in a different way like that. You know what I mean? I love throwing books at guys like that or whatever. I'm like, hey, you know what I mean? Like, you know, who would have thought you'd have a bunch of masculine men who have gotten into some Brene Brown?
Oh my God, I love
it.
I mean, I wish the world were more open-minded that way, because I think right now we're seeing something play out where there's a lot of, I think people feel deeply unsafe. Why? I don't know. Maybe it's exposure, technology, whatever, but there's a lot of reactivity building up. And as a result, instead of being in a position of curiosity and talking to one another and just trying to figure out, like, hey, where are the places that we overlap and we connect, there's this like immediate, like you said, judgment. And the thing that I find that's so interesting about all of it, without going into the details again, right, without the sort of controversy, is that when everyone's pointing their finger at each other, it's kind of like, you know, you said something earlier, like judgment is basically, it's judgment of things that we don't understand, but it's also something that we might be avoiding, right? And that is, I believe, that connection and vulnerability and authenticity and letting people be human and kind of explore who they are and figure it out, and letting people be human and explore and figure it out. It's like we've lost that, and there's this weird expectancy that, like, you have to think this way, and if you don't think this way, you're a horrible person. And that
cancel culture thing.
Oh my
that's
God,
nuts.
and it's happening everywhere.
Yeah, right.
To the point that now, if you're like a pretty centrist, moderate, kind of trying to like figure out the middle, the Venn diagram of all of it, now you're a bad person, and it's just like, oh my God.
Yeah, I've had people tell me that, you know, if you're not taking a position, then you're part of the problem. So basically saying that if you're not on one side or on the other, that you're the issue. And, you know, of course it created a little angst and anger in me.
Well, those are people who haven't gone
earned
to therapy.
earned the right to be a centrist, frankly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think the majority of us are, but we don't have it doesn't appeal to, because it doesn't fall in the extremities, it doesn't appeal to getting airtime. It doesn't soundbite well, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't draw in advertising dollars,
Right.
right? You know what I mean? Like the far sides of the spectrum tend to draw more controversy and ire and also attaboy positive attention on both sides. So those are the areas that get the most the most airplay and the most attention. And then the vast majority of us who sit in the middle and are reasonable, rational humans who aren't really on one side or on the other, which I think is most of us, are drawn basically our attention's being battled for by narratives that don't serve the way we see things. And and it's sad it's become that way, and it takes a lot to disconnect from that. It takes a lot for people who are kind of in the middle to say, hey, we're all in the middle.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, because the middle is so quiet that a lot of times, you'll talk to people and you'll find out that just everybody I talk to is like, man, I don't believe in that shit. And I don't believe in that shit. Everybody I talk to is in the middle. I don't really have very many people that I know that are really far on any one side. Most people that I know are like what we're talking about.
And it's interesting because when you think about it, it's almost like when you get to a certain stage in health and healing and recovery, you recognize that, part of your analogy of the volcano, it's like, it's not like the volcano's going anywhere. There's always potential for difficult, challenging, and hard things to happen. And I can also, when the difficult and hard things aren't happening, I can live in this place in my life where I feel a deep sense of peace and gratitude and creativity and appreciation for the day-to-day. And so when I see all of that, I'm like, oh, I think this is just kind of like a lack of, like, people who haven't done the work yet, just gathering up and
right.
like
it's either they haven't done the work yet or they're so caught in their own agendas. So there's both of those things, frankly. There are people that are caught up in those things because they lack self-awareness. And there are people that have such strong agendas that it actually serves a narrative that serves their purpose. The problem is the one person that has the agenda that serves the narrative is able to draw in the sheep on the one side and the lambs on the other. You know what I mean? Because, because that narrative supports a group that can rally around it on any side. And, you end up with a small percentage of the populace that really have a large percentage of the voice. And the rest of us in the middle that are reasonable, rational people that say, we don't really believe in either of that extreme stuff. And, but yet here we are. Right. So,
I mean, it almost sounds like addiction to scale in a way when you think about it. Addiction and codependency to scale. It's like, that big thing that you stay attached to no matter what the long-term negative effects are in any direction. So I want to go back to the ketamine thing because you asked such a good question, which is, can you be something to the effect of, can you be a purist in the addiction model, so to speak, and pursue these medications, right? These different forms of therapy.
Right.
And so my argument to that would be, yes, like this is another version of like centrism, right? Like how do we get into the middle and make room, not for every single thing and every single detail, but how do we make room for the multiplicity of options that are out there without the judgment, right?
Well, so I've often felt that in recovery, the most important thing is to keep that shit to yourself. Right? In other words,
like if you're going to do something that's outside
of outside of, sure, of course. Of course you would have your trusted group of people that, but circles in recovery are like those same extremists that we talk about, right? They tend to rally around the outside edges. And then you watch the people who, the hard part is that we watch people die that don't take things extreme enough.
Right. Yeah.
So when you watch, you stand in enough viewings and enough funerals and you put people in enough boxes, right? And then you realize why the people who stand so strong on one extreme side are doing so for a reason, because the reason is, and we talk about it in other areas too, like good examples are, and luckily I've never had it happen for me specifically, but to go through major surgery, right? And then to be prescribed an opiate, right? And then the question is, does the opiate set off something in me biologically or psychologically that lets the beast out of the cage? Because I've known people that have gone through surgery and taking medication as prescribed turned into a relapse. And here's an example, right? So I was still in active addiction. I was in the military, right? So I just basically, I toured the world on a bar stool, right? I switched seats on the Titanic, right? You know what I mean? And I because I worked on the flight deck and, it was 150 degrees ambient air temperature, I started making kidney stones. And so I had to have surgery for kidney stones. So I had surgery for kidney stones twice. Well, the second time I got kidney stones, they gave me Percocets. And I mean, it was a jar. It was like M&M. It was like this big container of them. And I was like, okay, I'm going to, take these Percocets as prescribed. And I got down to the end of those Percocets, and I was like, and it was a weekend. It was a Friday. And I said, I can't believe I want to say this. I made a decision to not drink water, right? So I don't pass this kidney stone, so it stays in my system. So that on Monday, when I went to the doctor and they did the IVP, they called it, which is where they, basically, looked to see where the stone was in your system, and they still saw it, they would re-up my perks. So I hung on to a kidney stone and didn't drink any water for a weekend until they gave me that big giant jar of perks and a piece of paper that said it was okay to have them. And then I drank 2 gallons of water and got rid of the stone and never said anything about it and ate the rest of the perks. Right? You know what I mean? But, like how powerful that you would put up with that level of pain, excruciating, in fact, just so that you could still hang on to. I don't ever take any light to, how powerful that, that underlying disease can really be, right? And, so, and at the same time, there's part of me that wonders about ketamine therapy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
I'm just being real.
No,
you know what I mean?
get it.
And I don't know where it really. I had ketamine once.
Oh, okay, recreationally.
Right? Yes, well, I couldn't get what I was looking for, and my dealer said, I got this ketamine, so you want to try that? And I was like, I'm addicted to anything that got me out of the way I was feeling at that moment. Yeah. Anything that got me out of me. So I did drugs I didn't even like. I didn't even know what they were. I was like, so I took a bag of ketamine home, and there was nobody home, and I did a line of ketamine. And then I remember for me, I after I came kind of out of it, I was like, now I know what the lion in the safari with the dart hanging out his ass feels like.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I mean? Because I was laying there and I was totally aware of what was going on, but I could not move. Yeah. I was just like, I was just frozen in time there for a while until it finally wore off. And I was just like, okay. They could have come over and checked my paws and my dental work or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like so that was like my, and I have a friend of mine who's also a gentleman that I sponsor, and he's had treatment on his back and his legs or whatever, and, some surgeries, and he had ketamine therapy several times and talked to me about it, but he didn't affect his clean time. Right? You know what I mean? It wasn't like it was a, but the strange thing is the appeal. That's the strange thing. Is it's like, does this really come from a place where it's like, I want to do it because it might address deeper issues? Or does it come from, I want to do it because there's an underlying appeal?
Well, we screen for that, right? I mean, there's a screen.
Are you telling me I don't qualify? Man, I should have just shut up.
Yeah, I mean, we have to make sure that that's not part of it.
I know.
And also, I'm in an IV clinic, so there's a nasal inhalant and there's a lozenge, or what we call a troche, that people take. But I work with a group where we do intravenous treatment, and we do that because of what's called the bioavailability. So you're getting max absorption into the body and as much effect on the neuroplasticity of the nervous system. Does that make it shorter life? Like, does it affect, do you recover from it quicker because it's it's IV injected? I mean, yeah, you're metabolizing it very quickly. So an intravenous session is 40 minutes long. And you're up for 40 minutes and you're back into your body at minute 55. I mean, it's an hour-long session. It's pretty incredible. I've gone through the treatment myself, so I never practice anything that I haven't experienced.
Now, did you practice it for the sake of experiencing the physical and psychological aspects, or did you use it because it ultimately would affect some of your past trauma history? And both. Yeah. And what was the after effect?
I mean, mind-blowing.
Really?
So, yeah, and keep in mind that people who are interested in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy or psychedelics in general, that if you're interested in psychedelics as a way to bypass, say like the doing the work part, the taking an inventory and knowing what you need to work on and knowing what you're carrying and building that rapport and having that therapeutic relationship, if you're trying to bypass that, you're probably just using substances, right? When you look at the studies, the thing that's so incredible about psychedelic-assisted therapy is the therapy part, right?
Okay.
And that's where we bring the medicine and the therapeutic process together. We make this incredible baby, and it has this incredible effect on an individual. And the outcomes in those studies are notable with and without the provider of services there.
Okay. Now, let me ask a question, just in the interest of trying to get some clarity. So, in my head, I've never really looked at ketamine as a psychedelic.
It's not.
Okay.
It's actually, I call it psychedelic adjacent. So it's really a tranquilizer. And if you think about the word tranquilizer in a less intense dose, right? A tranquilizer will bring a sense of tranquility to someone.
Right.
And so essentially what happens with ketamine when we can properly dose an individual and we have the therapeuticals in place and we know how much of this medicine can we administer to this individual, knowing that we're looking for a threshold, what we would call the therapeutic window. We're not going to send them into deep space, and we're also going to bring them up a bit from their life here on the ground, just enough so that what happens is they can, sometimes for the very first time in their life, experience a momentary bit of safety and peace and relief from all of the physiological and psychological burden that they carry, paired with an individual who comes into that space and is a guide and basically says, all right, here's what we decided we were going to work on. Let's go. And in my...
So would you say in that way you're addressing the subconscious without any restriction? Would that be...
yeah.
Full disclosure, my parents were DiNardo and DiNardo Hypnotherapy.
Oh, interesting.
In Lafayette Hill. So
interesting.
my dad was president of Hypnosis Union Local 476 in Philadelphia when I was growing up. So I have hypnotist parents for smoking and weight loss and, and phobias and things like that. So as a kid, when most people were, not even aware that a subconscious existed, I kind of was...
Yeah.
I was hearing a little bit about those things. So sometimes I'm thinking about how do these things really affect the subliminal mind? You know what I mean? Like, and I don't come from a position of a deep understanding because I lack the education, but I often do think like, okay, you know what I mean? Am I really, is this like a frontal thing or is this addressing a deeper version of me that's not really aware of? So.
It's all of the above. So what we're doing, and keep in mind that whole subconscious conscious mind, that's a little bit more Freudian, psychoanalytical. It's that sort of older model, and it doesn't negate that it's valid. But the trauma model is really working from a biological model and knowing about the brain and knowing about the nervous system.
Stuff that we didn't know 20 or 30 years ago.
No idea. Right. And now we know. So here's the deal in terms of healing and recovery is we know how to get people there, but now the problem is the system, and that's it. It's access.
Well, when you say system and access, we're talking about access to the materials themselves or the resistance of...
I mean like insurance companies and treatment and affordability.
There's a lot of other things that are going on right now that are different but similar, like microdosing and, you know what I mean? Like a lot of those things have become more, commonly discussed in the last probably decade that you never really heard about before.
I am a huge fan of microdosing. Oh my God, I can't wait for, if you're going to say you have to pick one treatment protocol that you would administer to the general population in terms of blending psychedelics with therapy with the goal of treatment.
It would be microdosing?
It would be microdosing. Because what you're doing is you're minimizing the landscape of the psychotropic effects of psychedelics, which can be very overwhelming for people.
So strangely, when my father passed in 2007, I was in a bad spot, and my regular physician, and wasn't seeing a psychologist or psychiatrist. He said, I'm going to give you a prescription for something. I was in a bad spot. He wrote me a prescription for this stuff called Effexor. I'd never had Effexor before. So I was on Effexor for a couple days. I remember right after I started taking it, okay, so now we'll tie into drug use. So when I was a kid, I used a lot of mushrooms and psychedelics and and at one point there was this strange sensation just before I started to go down that path. And it was like I can't quite describe it. It was almost like I had concrete in the back of my throat. It's just this weird sensation. It was like almost just before things got really interesting when I ate mushrooms, right? And when I ate this Effexor, I got that exact same sensation in the back of my throat. And then I was, the rest of it never came. It was like the train never arrived, you know what I mean? The colors and the, and the visuals and all that, it never arrived. But it was almost like, wow, is this tickling the same circuitry, right? Like, is this touching the same spot? Because, and it led me to believe, at least in part, that, and this is obviously like, not an educated viewpoint, but rather just a sensation. But that, in some ways, like that microdosing is kind of like a way of getting you there without the train ever reaching the station, just in terms of like that same thing that you were talking about. Like you never realize the result of that deeper level of, but get to that point where, because the reality of it is, magic mushrooms are like the happy thing. You know what I mean? Like people are like, he, you know what I mean? Like before. So, and for me, like the Effexor, in the end, I stopped taking it. And I remember saying that it felt like it took the teeth out of the lion. Like it made it so I couldn't, things that clearly I needed to be mad about, I was not mad about at all. Yeah. And I was like, okay, like this is, there's a time and a place for this, and and it was good while it lasted. And then the downside of coming off it was brutal. Yeah. Oh, it was brutal. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, probably one of the worst times of my life was coming off of it. But it makes me think that, they might be going down the right path, at least in terms with microdosing, because they're tinkering with something that's a natural version of, what you get pharmacologically. You know what I mean? Like it's something there. You know what I mean? Like I don't know exactly what that is, and it's strange how it would all be tied to a sensation that you taught. But I'm like, hey, this is weird. That's exactly that same sensation I get when I ate shrooms when I was younger.
Yeah, and I mean, that's not to say that I'm not against the psychotropic, psychedelic effect of psychedelics. I think people experience, I've seen miracles happen in ketamine therapy where to this day, I'm like, holy shit. Like just, okay. People who had a death wish who now want to live and embrace life, and they want to have these relationships, and they want to work on themselves, and they're in their hearts.
Wow, like a complete 180-degree.
Combat veterans. Actually, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy through intravenous treatment. I remember first hearing about it when I was in graduate school, so that was 12 years ago. And it was kind of this like new thing that was happening. Right. And we were working with combat vets. And why combat veterans? Because we know that they're exposed. The screening for trauma is done. And we were seeing in some cases, something like 75 to 90% symptom reduction in one treatment. And so here we are. This is what I mean. All these years later, we know it works, but we just can't.
Still don't have.
We just can't get it.
Right.
So in my big ish, right, or ick right now.
Well, what do you think is the agenda behind it? When you say not getting it, it's because
it's a
Mother
for-profit
Merck and GSK can't make money off it.
It's a for-profit healthcare system, and we're one of the few countries in the world that spends 95% of our GDP dollars for healthcare on post-diagnostic treatment. So we're going to wait for people to get sick, and then we're going to invest. Right. And any other model in a well-developed nation in the world is prevention-based. And they both economically thrive, but somewhere along the way we got this idea, and we just haven't had enough people that are man enough and woman enough to say, we're not doing this anymore, and we're changing it. So, again, in this more centrist view, I have some hopes that some of what's going on right now, although some of it I'm like, what are we doing here? But there are some people that I'm like, I don't necessarily like how it's going down, but I'm giving some, vote or some hope to the idea that some of these things will be dismantled and rebuilt in a way where we move more toward a prevention model.
I'm really glad you said that, because there's and this ties into, so this article I just wrote recently called The Strategic Inflection Point We All Face, right? And we're in another one of those, right? And there, of course, there's a danger of dismantling what is to rebuild what's new.
Yeah.
Right? There's no question about that.
Yeah.
And there's a stress that comes along with that.
Yeah.
But there's also a lack of sustainability in where we're at right now, just in terms of the, the infrastructure that's resistant to change, and it's the burgeoning hierarchy of complexity that makes it just about impossible to do things new unless there's a financial interest from people that are quietly behind the scenes pulling the strings. So, and that same exact person that I saw that they were, look, a heroin addict is going to be in charge of this, you know what I mean? And but I thought to myself, like, what he really wants to do and what this whole Doge thing really wants to do is dismantle a lot of the resistance to change and a lot of the bureaucracy so that we can get to being able to make changes quicker and more effective. And matter of fact, something that a friend of mine and I are working on something right now that's Department of Defense related, and it's about Department of Defense procurement. And there's another thing where there's an incredible amount of resistant infrastructure to change. And meanwhile, China is kicking our ass, right? Because they can get technologies to their warfighter faster than we can, because we've got this giant bureaucracy that's set out to basically resist new technologies coming that would make us dominant as a warfighter. So it's scary, but necessary. You know what I mean? Like, it's scary but necessary. What we were doing wasn't sustainable. So sooner or later it was going to run us aground. And, we ended up with, one extreme, which was an extreme letting things go and trying to protect that, to another extreme, which is an extreme break it and rebuild it from scratch, which is just as scary, frankly. But I don't think any of us could really afford to allow things to go long term the way they were going, because sooner or later it would kill the host. It was like gangrene. Like, something had to be done.
Yeah, and I'm not qualified to speak on warfare. I mean, I grew up in a household and I was exposed to the aftermath of warfare, and
Right.
I've had some very intimate relationships with people who have been exposed to combat and watched that all transpire across the timeline. And I'm a mom and I'm a nurturer, and I like my baby animals, and
Me too.
I'm an idealist in the sense that, like, if I could live in a world where we didn't need guns and bombs, like,
Oh yeah.
I think that would be pretty cool. So that part of it, I don't feel qualified to speak to. But one point that I agree on is that, and I don't like how a lot of this is being done. I think something that's really missing right now is empathy globally has like left the building, and I feel so sad for that. And at the same time, if you go to mythology, there are mythological representatives or representation in mythology of people being the great destroyer, and that those roles in archetypes exist to tear down things that needed to be torn down and rebuilt. And so when I can zoom out, I can see that there's potential there for that. Again, I don't like I don't like the environment, the feeling of the environment, and I feel scared sometimes.
I don't think anybody really does. You know what I mean?
Like, some people are like, yeah.
Well, but it's the people that are like, yeah. Like, I probably watched more what's going on in the last couple of weeks than I've watched in a long time, just because I couldn't watch it. And frankly, there's a fearful aspect of it that knows that, you could potentially kill the host. Yeah. Right. It's, at the same time, you also realize that ultimately the disease that we had would have eventually killed the host anyway, because you can't, sooner or later you run up the debt to the point where nobody could ever pay it off. Right.
Right.
And that was kind of like where we were really out on the other side. So it's really like, you're faced with, no wins on either side. And then the rational, reasonable people who sit in the middle go, well, couldn't we get something that was a little bit less, hard or harsh?
Right.
At the same time, you also realize that there was no comfortable, you can't wait till you're so obese that you need, full-on surgery at that level, right? Without pain.
Right.
Like it's the pain that comes with it. And that's the hard part is nobody really wanted to experience the pain in the first place, which is the reason why we kind of like didn't watch.
Yeah.
Even though we postulated and imagined that, hey, things aren't really quite right here. Like they're not really telling us.
No,
right?
I mean, look, I've been in the healthcare system for 12 years now. And I started out in addiction in a state and county funded treatment center, 150 beds, almost all intravenous, addicted people coming through. My first mentor and colleague was a Vietnam veteran, and rest in peace. He also died during the pandemic and was an amazing man. And I'm 12 years in, and I'm still working in trauma and addiction. And nothing has changed. And to me, if we can, with all of the advancement in technology that we have and everything that we know now, we can go 12 years and things only get worse. Something needs to be dismantled.
Right,
and it's a really fucked up system. So I don't like it. I don't like what we're experiencing right now. I don't like the sort of cultural side effect of all of this. And at the same time, when I zoom out, I'm like, well, if this is what has to be done, again, I wish there were more of a
kinder, gentler way. Me too.
I do, and at the same time, there's this part of me that's gets existential, and maybe it's because of my experience with psychedelics, but I'm curious to see what happens, But
it's an exercise in letting go.
I mean, seriously, what is anybody going to do about it? So, I think having conversations is really important. Hopefully playing a role in, I started this thing last month with a friend of mine where we bring 10 down to 9 people together once a month, and nobody knows anybody's affiliation, but the topic is making politics safe again. And so we have a way of moving into talking about what we're experiencing in this moment in time, but without any permission yet to really identify who's what, or
who comes from what position.
And it's fascinating. Everyone's saying the same thing. I used to love to talk about it. I used to love to talk about what's going on in current events with my friends. I used to love to pay attention to it.
People are afraid that because their viewpoints could potentially be different, they'll be ostracized, so they're less likely to, which is the reason why everybody in the middle is quiet and everybody in the outside edges who doesn't really give a shit how they're viewed. They're the ones that are all loud because they're not afraid. They're surrounded themselves with other people that are like-minded and are also surrounding them. So we're all sitting in the middle being quiet because we don't want to be ostracized for being in the middle. And then you find out when we all get to talk that most of us really are.
Yeah. 100%. And so I think what's really interesting about all of it is that when you think about it, it's almost like, what does this really mean? It's that we've lost sight of emotion regulation and vulnerability and connection. And so again, if this is part of what has to happen, like I said, I have a lot of different thoughts and feelings on it, but in the bigger view, I'm like, all right, well, let's see what happens next,
Don't really have a choice in the matter now. We're along for the ride.
I know. So here we are, right? Talking about letting go. But I know we've kind of bobbed and weaved all over the place.
That was kind of the idea, though.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? This is exactly what was supposed to happen.
This is what you do.
This is what we do.
I like it.
Yeah, it's cool.
I like it. But I do want to answer that question about if people are interested in psychedelic therapies as a way to complement or enhance or help forward their journey and their recovery. The thing that's so interesting is we are now using these medicines to treat addiction.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have had people come in. I'm thinking about this one case more recently where it was someone who came in, and I knew that drinking was most likely a pretty significant factor in why they were cycling through some of what they were cycling through. But at the same time, it was also very managed and very manageable. And this person, when you talk about high functioning, super high functioning, to the point that it's like gray area, like gray drinking. And they had been through a very significantly traumatic event, immediate loss of life of a loved one and all kinds of other things. It was horrible. And other past experiences that led to a lesser sense safety around their emotional self and whatever. And so they went through the standard treatment protocol for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And this wasn't even a treatment goal, but they gave up drinking and they haven't had a drink since, and it's going on like 2 years, year and a half or something like that. But it's not...
For my recovery peeps, we might want to check this out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just so, in case you're watching this,
Yeah. And the important factors are who you're working with, that these are trained people, that there is screening, there's goal setting, and that...
And this is a therapeutic process. It's not just...
It's therapy.
Again, for all my people that are just trying to get on, this is not for you. All right. There we go. Now we got that. We want to get that out of the way too. All right. So...
It's therapy.
Right.
It's therapy with the supportive substance. And this is interesting. My whole career, I have people coming in who are experiencing polypharmacology. So they're on 4, 5, 6, 7. I've had combat vets walk into my office who are like, I'm being treated at the VA and I'm, 12 medications deep.
Right.
I'm still working with drugs and therapy, right? And what's happening in a lot of those cases is symptoms are just worsening and
well, because it compounds that with a deeper... Right. It just opens up the doorway to...
Nobody knows. Nobody in science knows. I'm sorry. Nobody in science knows what happens when you take 12 different drugs and put them in someone's body and 8 of them are psychopharmacological. Like, we just don't know that. We don't have that data. But we do that treatment all based on side effects and whether or not medicines are contraindicative. But we don't look at...
psychological complications.
We don't look at
with
metabolism.
Right.
I mean, we now have, this is what I mean. We have something called, I call it gene site testing, but it's,
now when you say metabolism, we're not talking about food metabolism. We're talking how we metabolize the drugs.
Yeah. So we know from studies that, for example, and I'm pulling for an example, but it doesn't mean that this is the data. I would need to open up my laptop and make sure I'm citing this properly. But for example, a woman who is Chinese born versus a Caucasian male are going to have 2 completely different ways that they metabolize the same drug.
Now, metabolization includes how long it stays in your system as well as how you process it.
Yeah, and or absorption or non-absorption.
Right. Okay.
So I mean,
so one could be wholly less effective or ineffective, whereas the other one could be completely effective.
Well, and then when we take a look at things like gender-based studies or age, like our hormones change. Males' hormones change as females, our hormones change. And that is a significant factor in terms of what the body does across time. And again, I'm not a medical doctor. I just love science and I get all kind of gooey in it. But we do these like very simple controlled studies. And here's what I want to say to people, because I've seen a lot of this in the news. Peer review is bad. It's not. Science and data is beautiful, right? It's what people do with that science and data and how
it's in the interpretation or lack thereof.
Or the marketing of the data.
Right.
It's not a lie. It's just maybe we left something out or we scrunched up that graph like this.
Or we highlight it with a long string of legalese in, I'm not a lawyer, but we used to call it when we draft contracts, the weasel clause. Yeah. Right. You know what I mean? So, you could take this drug, but it might cause you everything, including death.
Right.
Right. You know what I mean? We just get that out of the way.
Right.
And then if you opt in, and things don't work out okay for you, that's on you.
Well, so going back to psychedelics, what's really interesting is we can do double blinds, right, with things like SSRIs or whatever. So, okay, we can do a study where we take, all right, I'm going to give James an SSRI and I'm going to give Dean a placebo. And the SSRI and the placebo group don't look that different, but there's enough that we can say like, oh, this actually has a positive effect. Whereas it's hard to do that with psychedelics in a psychotropic form because you're going to know if you're tripping or not. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes, you will. Hey, listen, here we go.
I mean, it's that simple. You're going to know this is definitely not the placebo.
Yeah, I think that I can't speak from experience, but to the fans, that sounds accurate to me. I don't know. I can neither confirm nor deny.
Well,
okay, cool. So, that was awesome.
it's true. I mean, but so it's harder to test in those studies,
Right.
whether or not, what do we know about outcomes? But we can still measure outcomes.
But you could but those studies probably would work in low dose psychotropics, like for example,
in a
in the
microdose.
microdose, right? That's different.
We can get away with placebo. And so, okay, you're talking about navigating the FDA, navigating controlled,
I'll
substances.
say this: I remember when I was on the FXR, calling my mom like 2 days later, and literally like crying on the phone, going, "It's a miracle."
Oh yeah.
Like just the level of it was like somebody hit a switch, and it was like that pain of, and I just held my dad's hand while he passed. Just 2 weeks before, I was all mess.
Yeah.
And then suddenly I was like, oh my God. Right. So so if low dose psychotropics or microdosing or whatever give people that same level of effect. Now,
I want to say something just really quickly. I don't want people listening to this to think that I'm anti-pharmacology. I'm not.
Right.
But when you look at, keep in mind, I'm a trauma therapist. Like I'm not, singular in my approach. So when you look at what the full spectrum of healing and recovery looks like, an SSRI can be a brilliant tool to get someone stable. It can be incredible. It's life-saving.
Right.
And at the same time, stability isn't the only goal in recovery and healing. We're talking about like going further down the train tracks. And so how do we help people get into those spaces where they've quieted down those emotional parts and they've learned to avoid and almost repress all of that.
So let me share something. So I buried a friend of mine 3 years ago. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being, incredibly creative. When I was at a year clean, he asked me to be to sponsor him, and literally he called me and said, "I want to attend one of those 12-step meetings," and I said, "Well, come on out." And he came out. He didn't know I was sharing for my 1-year anniversary, so I literally showed up at a meeting and I put him in a chair, and then I went around and sat at the table and spoke for a year. A day later, he asked me to sponsor him, and I said yes. And after talking to my sponsor, who said, because I was concerned about we had gotten high together for years. I know, like we partied a lot, and he was like, I don't see anywhere in the literature that says that, unless you have a long-standing history together. He says, if you don't think it's going to get in the way, help him. So I guided him through the whole process, right? Now, and he got after it. He, we went deep, and that exploration is, if you do it correctly, is a deep one. You know what I mean? Like there are certain fellowships where you can be all through 12 steps in a week or a couple days or whatever, but it's just not, the exploration for me was deep in searching. Right. And for that reason, it was impactful. And I think a lot of the reason why it was impactful was because, at least in part for me, there was a desperation that came from the exploration that was painful, which made me want to go deep. And that pain that I experienced while I was doing that exploration forced me to gain some faith and some tools and some other things. And it was basically like the only way to learn how to sail through the storm was to sail the fuck through it. Period. Right. And in fact, the only reason why I learned how to use these tools that they gave me was because, what do they say? Smooth seas don't make skillful sailors, right? Like I had to be in the middle of the storm with the tools, right? You know what I mean? And then you learn like, oh shit, like I have to use these tools, right? And because I was in pain, you know what I mean? Like I got, I don't want to say good at it, but I believe I got better at it than I would have been without it. If I was just like, it's okay, but let me just, you know what I mean? Like I was in the storm. So my friend was on SSRIs and he worked through the process. But I at least in part felt that, and I sensed it, that he wasn't getting the same thing from it that I was. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think in a way, remember what I said when I was on SSRIs, I took the tooth out of the lion, right? I wasn't really bothered by anything. So I'm not sure that, this is an outside observation. I could never really know what happened. You know what I mean? But, you know, there was a part of me that felt that, you know, maybe what happened was that he didn't stand in the storm like I did, you know? And because I wasn't able to take a position on an outside issue because of the way we're structured, and because that was prescribed by, a physician, I had to take the position of, well, I'm going to guide him through the process just like me. But sometimes I wonder whether we put him in a box because of it.
Oh,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, you know what I mean? Because, you know, and the reality, and I don't know, like it's just something that's bounced around in my head over the years. You know what I mean? Because I remember like while we were going through the process thinking about like what we just reviewed, if she was on the other foot, when I was reviewing it with the guy that was guiding me, I was a fucking mess. And I was a mess for a minute. Like it was cathartic.
Yeah.
Right? And when we went over things that the content was, for all intents and purposes, what I would have considered would have been intense and ultimately led to some catharsis, for him didn't really seem like it had the same effect.
Right.
And I thought to myself, like, did we just sail around the storm?
Well, I mean,
You know what I mean?
I can't, I don't know the details.
I can't really speak to whether
possible.
or not. Yeah, I can't really speak to whether or not. So that's one of the reasons why, like, there's part of me that thinks that, you know, maybe there's still part of me that thinks that wonders like whether or not this process would be okay. Go there it is. Yeah. Come on now.
I just,
it was bouncing around in there. I was like, come on now.
That you said, and it made me think of, I went through this phase where I like hyper ingested Anderson Cooper's podcast on grief.
Okay.
Whether people like Anderson Cooper or not, the podcast is incredible. And it is talking to people about their experience with grief and loss and trauma. And he interviews someone, and I can't remember what his name is, but he's from the music industry, and he goes, grief is a patient bitch.
Right?
Yeah.
Truth.
And it is true. And so I don't know what happened with your friend, but if we're talking about someone who struggled with addiction, and then of course, there was, medication
we had buried his brother from brain cancer 6 or 7 years before. So yeah, obviously he had other things, right? You know what I mean? And frankly, the truth of it is that maybe those SSRIs kept him alive.
Right.
Right. You know what I mean? So
it could have kept him alive, or it could have kept him repressed. I mean, we just don't really know.
Remember what we talked about. You know what I mean? The illusion of control.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Sometimes you come back and you go, well, wait a minute. You know what I mean? Like sometimes it's just recognizing that.
Yeah, we don't know. And
I ain't in charge of what happens, and you know what I mean. And what I think ultimately may be responsible or not is just it's a postulation at best. I have no idea what actually caused it. But there was part during the journey where I was kind of thinking to myself, like, like, you know what I mean, like,
yeah,
So,
and you know what? Here's the thing: is like, let's just hypothesize that this person, had this history of addiction and was seeing some kind of medical doctor, and they were treating this person with an SSRI or some version of an antidepressant, anti-anxiety,
right?
And they didn't have, and I'm not saying that this is always happening in the field of medicine. I'm not here to talk badly about the professions that I'm identifying, but let's just say that this person didn't have any kind of real training around mental health, which a lot of medical doctors, they get like 3 seconds of it before they're on to the next thing, right? Yeah. So there are so many factors.
Get a prescription pad.
Yeah, there's so many factors that we could learn about, in terms of what this friend knew or didn't know, was told, wasn't told. But a lot of people go to the doctor, they get this prescription, and then they think, okay, this is what it's going to be. This is what's going to help. But it's not. This is what I talked about earlier. It's that community and trauma counseling piece. It's that medication is incredible. And I learn and work with some of the most knowledgeable people in the city of Philadelphia. And they say, look, it is a piece of the pie. But when you have a medical model that says, here is the pie, and you're only getting one slice, eventually someone's going to figure that out. And if they don't figure it out, their body's going to figure it out.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And so it's...
So the medication itself, without the journey, including the counseling and the therapy and the other things, is really setting yourself up for potential doom or failure. It could.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about, I'm just going to pull on a piece of data that I think is probably pretty accurate, that if the treatment protocol is medication and there is no other work or support or integration around that medication, you're going from, if we look at, a traditional SSRI like Prozac, right? We're talking like 40, 50, 60% of the people that take these medicines in these studies notice some kind of positive effect with a decline over time, right? So we're taking that, and then what we're doing is we're reducing all of those other potential wellness factors, including diet, by the way, which is massive.
Okay.
Huge.
Say more about that.
Well, so a lot of these medications are, if you're talking about an SSRI specifically, you're talking about something called selective serotonin reuptake, and it's an inhibitor to that. So nerve cells in the brain have a process where there's something called a synaptic channel. So you've got these two brain cells, and they have an axon and dendrite, right? So a termination of the cell and an active or an initiation spot in the cell. And you've got a river that flows through it. And so all of these neurotransmitters are flowing through that river. And what happens is the cell grabs the neurotransmitter, which is like a key, and it says to the cell, this is what I do. So it's feel good, or I make you rest, or I give you energy, or I get you paying attention, or I get you to calm down. And what happens is that, it's kind of weird how it works. It's really fascinating. But that SSRI, it blocks that. It doesn't block that the serotonin.
It's an uptake inhibitor, so it blocks the uptake of.
It prevents basically the absorption and like pushing it back out into the channel.
Right.
So neurotransmitters essentially for a period of time don't exist in the synaptic channel. They're basically absorbed into the cell and then pushed back out.
Okay.
It's like ingestion and then digestion. So essentially what's happening is it's keeping the serotonin in the synaptic channel, which is making the brain think that there's more serotonin. So it's grabbing more of it and turning on these keys, but it's not getting absorbed, right? It's really, and that's my very elementary way of explaining this. Like, I do not have a degree in this. Okay. But what we do know is that people take an SSRI thinking, oh, I'm going to get more serotonin. I'm going to get more feel-good chemicals. Serotonin is born in the gut. So if you're taking an SSRI, but you have a shitty diet and you're dumping a bunch of stuff into your body that's going to affect your gut biome and your gut health, you're minimizing the likelihood of the body actually producing more serotonin to get it up through the blood-brain barrier and into the brain itself.
Okay.
So
I'm glad I said say more.
You know what I mean? And again, for anybody who's listening, you could go read about it and you'll probably get a much more detailed version of how the science works. But I like learning about these things. But
eat well, feel good is much more than just
It's huge.
Right.
And not to mention...
biologically huge.
Well, not to mention that something that we're learning now also is... it's theoretical. We're still learning about it. It's called the polyvagal theory, and we're learning about how the nervous system develops across time. But when you think about it, this thing up here is probably the second or maybe the third brain to develop. And the first brain is your gut brain.
Right.
So you're an infant, and you know when you're hungry and you know that you need to scream, but you're not having thoughts. You're not like, I wonder where my mom is, and is she washing dishes? You're like, hungry, screaming.
Right.
So that it's so big, all of it, how it all unfolds and how it develops, but a lot of these factors can be reduced into something fairly simple. And so going back to that piece about prescribing, I think a lot of people get a lot of hope from the idea of being prescribed and feeling some of that immediate relief, like, oh my God, I notice this.
Mm-hmm.
But when we don't have poly-integrated support systems that come into play,
Right.
and we're not working with someone who's having us be self-aware and paying attention and having that safe, say no matter what relationship,
Right.
you've
Right.
bought yourself time, but it doesn't mean that you've bought yourself healing. And those are two different things.
Right. 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 Developing some level of intentionality by getting guidance from others.
Yeah. And having that practice of, or it's almost like you don't go on a diet, you change the way that you eat as a lifestyle.
Right.
It's like, we don't integrate mental health into our culture the way that we could. And it's so weird because we always in tribal cultures and even post-industrial cultures, like we had the medicine man or the medicine woman or you know what I mean?
Right.
We got rid of that.
We got rid of that.
I don't know why.
Right.
But when we have that relationship,
Right.
it's so big. I mean, you said you're like, I've had these two people in my life where it's like life-changing to have that.
Right. Right.
But it's not because of, it's not them. They're a catalyst and
Right.
creating a consistent process and a practice for you around your stuff.
Right.
Just like I know that if I eat a certain kind of way, I'm going to feel a certain kind of way, good or
Right.
bad. So anyway.
This was killer, by the way.
Good.
Right.
Yeah, I loved it.
Surprised?
No, I mean,
You didn't know what to expect.
I didn't know
when you
what to
walked in.
expect.
I was like, cool.
But when someone's like, hey, you're a trauma therapist, do you want to come and talk to me? I'm like, yeah, sure. I figure it's going to be pretty good.
Well, so let's talk about the Center KSQ. So your location is in Kennett Square, which is in southern Chester County in Pennsylvania. If somebody needed help, they would go to thecenterksq.com.
Correct.
Right. I know there's information on there about trauma therapy. I know there's stuff on there about mediation therapy, and I know there's also stuff about like ketamine therapy and other psychotropic therapy that may, in fact, I think eventually, based on this conversation, be in the pipeline. So
cool.
I would certainly, based on this conversation, if you're local to this region, I would reach out and find Winden or her team on the website. And I would also, at the same time, say that if you're not local and you're seeing this, feel free to reach out on the website to get some guidance as to where maybe in your local area you could go. One thing's for sure. Don't be in pain and not get help. So, Winden, thank you so much for coming out. This was fantastic.
I'm
really
so
enjoyed
glad
that.
that I got to be here. And
We
meet
went to the
you
edge of the
guys.
volcano a little bit. We did a little bit of
Yeah.
everything that we talked about.
Yeah, thank you.
That was awesome.
Thank you
That was
for
awesome.
your sharing and I love it. I love a real conversation.
Yeah, that was cool.
Yeah.
That was cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
All right, so there we go. That's Dancing on a Volcano, Season 2, Episode 3 with Winden Rowe. And thanks so much for coming out. That was awesome.